Blaine Cartwright stepped into Portia Akinwale's path before she reached the front door, and took the paper bag out of her hand. Not asked for it, took it. "I need you to come to the back," he said. His voice was the quiet kind of authoritative, the kind that doesn't expect to be questioned. "Our loss prevention team has flagged a concern." What concern? It wasn't a question. Portia said it the way she said most things, as a statement that expected an answer. "We have reason to believe you've concealed merchandise." "I haven't concealed anything. I paid for everything in that bag at the register 11 minutes ago." "Ma'am, I have a receipt." His jaw moved. His hand stayed on her bag. "I'm going to need you to come to the back office." "I'm not going to a back office." She looked at him steadily. "If you'd like to see the receipt, I'm happy to show it to you here." Have you ever watched a person's certainty collapse so completely that you could see the exact moment the floor went out from under them? Because you're going to want to stay here, drop a like, and let me take you back to how this afternoon started. 2 hours earlier, Portia Akinwale had been sitting at the center bench of a federal courtroom on Wellington Street West, listening to an advocate wrap up closing submissions in a constitutional matter that had been before her for 9 months. She was a justice of the Federal Court of Canada. She had been appointed at 39. She was 46 now. Before the bench, 12 years as a litigator, 4 of them as senior counsel at the Department of Justice in Ottawa. She knew procedural law the way other people know the layout of their own kitchens, without having to think about it, without having to look. On court mornings she wore her robes. On the rare afternoons when she managed a personal errand during the noon recess, she changed in chambers into whatever she had come in wearing. Today that was dark jeans, a gray wool sweater that had been washed so many times it had softened to the texture of something much more expensive than it was, and a brown winter coat she had owned for 6 years. She wore plain gold studs in her ears. She carried a flat leather document folio, the kind that holds an agenda, notes, and identification looped over one wrist. She had 90 minutes. Her niece's birthday was Thursday. The boutique on King Street had a display of art books in the window that she had noticed from a taxi 3 weeks ago and had not had time to revisit until now. She walked in, took her time, chose 3 books, a collection of Canadian landscape photography, an illustrated guide to West African textiles, a children's book about a girl who builds her own telescope, and paid at the register. The woman behind the counter, whose name tag said Jess, was 23 years old and wrapped each book carefully in tissue paper and placed them in a stiff paper bag with handles. She said, "Have a great afternoon," and she meant it, and Portia thanked her and headed for the door. That was when Blaine Cartwright stepped into her path. He was 34 years old. He had managed this location for 2 years. In those 2 years, the boutique had received 5 internal complaints about the way he handled suspected theft situations. All 5 came from customers who were black or visibly a person of color. All 5 had been submitted through the corporate feedback portal. All 5 had been reviewed by the regional operations manager and closed with no findings and no follow-up. Blaine had never been spoken to about a single one of them. He had received a written commendation in his most recent performance review for maintaining a low shrinkage rate. He stood in front of Portia now with the particular posture of a man who has already written the last line of the report in his head. "I'm not going to the back," she said again. "Loss prevention protocol requires." "Your protocol does not override my right to leave this store. I made a purchase. I have a receipt. You're welcome to verify it here, in front of everyone." Blaine's neck went red. He turned his head. Kyle Hennessy was 22 and 6 months into this job and had not yet learned the difference between following a lead and being complicit in something. He moved forward from the window display section without fully understanding why. He was broad and young and uncertain in the specific way of someone who has been given authority before he understood its weight. "She's not cooperating," Blaine said. "Call it in." "I am cooperating," Portia said. The words were the same temperature they had been the first time. "I offered to show you the receipt. That is cooperation." Kyle looked at Blaine. Blaine nodded. Kyle called it in. At the cosmetics counter 4 meters away, a woman named Delphine set down the eyeshadow palette she had been restocking and watched. She had worked at this location for 4 years. She had seen the shape of this before. Not the exact scene. The exact scene changed details, changed faces, changed which merchandise section it happened near, but the shape was always the same. She thought about saying something. She decided against it, then reconsidered, then decided against it again. She had a mortgage and a daughter in grade 7, and she had learned which fights she could afford to lose on this floor. She took out her phone. She held it against her hip, angled so the lens had a clear line. She pressed record. The 2 officers who arrived were from 52 Division. Sergeant Mitch Pallister was 41 years old, 19 years on the force, and he had the practiced calm of someone who has answered enough retail calls to have a template ready before he walks through the door. Constable Daramaro was 28, 3 years in, and she followed half a step behind him the way she always did in his presence, not from subordination, but from the habit of watching how he read a room. Blaine met them at the entrance. He used the word suspected concealment. He used the word uncooperative. He used the phrase our loss prevention team flagged the behavior. Pallister looked past him at Portia. She was standing beside a display table in the center of the floor. The paper bag was in her right hand. Her left hand was relaxed at her side. Her posture was so composed it read as almost architectural. She was watching Blaine with an expression that contained nothing. No fear, no anger, no performance of innocence, just attention, the kind that records everything. Pallister walked toward her. "Can you tell me what happened here, ma'am?" "I purchased 3 books. I was on my way out. This stopped me, took my bag, and told me he believed I'd concealed merchandise. I have the receipt on my phone. I've offered to show it twice. He hasn't looked at it." Pallister glanced back at Blaine. "Do you have footage of her taking anything?" A pause. "Our protocol was triggered by—" "Do you have footage of her concealing merchandise?" Another pause. Longer, the profile indicated. "I need a yes or a no." Blaine said nothing. Pallister turned back to Portia. "If you've got the receipt, that should wrap this up fairly quickly." She reached into her coat pocket for her phone. As she did, the leather document folio she had been carrying looped over her wrist shifted. The strap slipped. The folio slid off the edge of the display table where she had rested it. It fell. It hit the polished concrete floor cover side up. Pallister was closer. He reached for it at the same time she bent, and it opened on the floor between them, the front cover folding back, the interior visible to anyone standing above it. The judicial identification card was in a clear sleeve on the right panel. Her photograph was on the left. Her name was printed in both official languages beneath the photo. Below the name, her title, Justice of the Federal Court of Canada, Juge de la Cour fédérale du Canada, and embossed into the leather of the cover itself, in the way that official documents are made to last, the Canadian coat of arms, the maple leaves, the lion, the shield, the motto pressed deep into dark brown leather. Amari usk admar. Pallister stood up slowly. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the credential. He looked at Portia. He looked at the credential again. He had stood before 2 federal court justices in 19 years. Once at a divisional function he had been brought to by his captain. Once in a courtroom in a judicial review proceeding where his own division had been the respondent. Both times, the person on the bench had seemed to exist in a different atmospheric register than the one he breathed in day to day. He had not made any connection between that register and the woman in the gray sweater. "Justice Akinwale." He said it quietly, not to anyone specifically. "The way you say a name when you are confirming that what you're seeing is real." "Yes," Portia said. 4 seconds. 4 seconds of silence on that shop floor. Later, Delphine would say that those 4 seconds were the clearest thing in the whole video. Clearer than the argument, clearer than the arrival of the officers, clearer than Portia walking out. The silence was where everything became visible. What Blaine Cartwright's face did in those 4 seconds was the kind of thing that happens rarely in public and almost never on camera. The certainty he had walked in with, the certainty that had been building in him for 2 years, sustained by 5 closed complaints and 1 written commendation, went out of his expression like a light going off. What replaced it had no name, exactly. It was something between white and nothing. Kyle took a step back. Pallister straightened. He held the folio out to Portia with both hands, the way you return something to someone when you have understood, belatedly, what it is. "I owe you an apology, Justice." "You responded to a call," she said. "You asked a reasonable question." She looked at Blaine. "He didn't ask a reasonable question. He made a decision before I got to the door." Pallister turned to Blaine. His tone did not change, exactly, but something in the arrangement of his voice did. "I'm going to need to see the footage you mentioned, and I'm going to need a formal statement from you and your staff, today." Blaine's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Now," Pallister said. Portia picked up her paper bag. She picked up her folio. She looked once across the store at Delphine, who was still standing at the cosmetics counter with her phone held at her hip. Not a long look, just the kind of glance that two women exchange when they both understand exactly what has just happened and neither of them needs to say so out loud. Then she walked to the front door and left. She didn't go back to court that afternoon. She called her clerk and asked for the next morning's session to be pushed by 1 hour, citing a personal matter, and she did not explain further. She sat in her car in a parking garage on Mercer Street and let the hum of the fluorescent lights settle around her. She did not cry. She was not surprised. That was its own kind of weight. The fact that she had seen the shape of it coming from the moment Blaine stepped in front of her, that nothing about it had managed to surprise her, not once. She drove home. She changed. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table and wrote down every detail she could remember in order with times. The layout of the floor, Blaine's exact words, the way Kyle had hesitated before making the call, the 4 seconds after Pallister read her name, all of it in the same handwriting she used for judicial notes, small, even, unhurried. She had been doing this her whole career, writing things down before memory could soften them into something more bearable. At 11 o'clock that night, Delphine posted the video to her personal account. No hashtags. One sentence as a caption. "This happened at my workplace today and I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it." The video was 44 seconds long. It showed Portia standing in the center of the boutique floor. It showed the paper bag and the 2 officers and Blaine beside the display table. It showed Pallister bending to pick up the folio. It showed 4 seconds of absolute stillness. It showed Portia walking out. It did not explain what Pallister had read or what had happened to Blaine's face. It didn't need to. People who watched it understood the shape of it before the video finished loading. By 7 the next morning, it had been shared 60,000 times. By noon, 3 national outlets had picked it up. The boutique's parent corporation, a retail group headquartered in Montreal with 43 locations across Canada, issued a statement by 2 o'clock expressing deep concern and promising an immediate internal review. The statement used the phrase, "the incident." It did not name Blaine. Portia read the statement. She had drafted enough decisions in her career to know what an institution sounded like when it had not yet decided how much it was willing to own. She filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission the following afternoon. She filed as a private citizen. Not because her judicial credential was irrelevant. It wasn't, and it would be cited, but because she did not want the story to be about what she was. She wanted it to be about what had been done. The investigator assigned to the file was a woman named Constance Yip. Yip was 43, methodical, and had spent a decade processing files that most people filed and then waited months to hear about. She pulled the store's complaint history her first evening with the file. She found 5 prior complaints, all 5 closed with no findings. All 5 cleared through the same regional operations manager, whose name appeared on every closure document. She noted the demographics, she noted the dates, she noted the pattern. Within 4 days, 2 former employees had contacted the commission independently. One had video on her phone. 3 incidents she had witnessed over the course of 18 months, recorded because she had not known what else to do with what she was seeing and had needed it to exist somewhere other than her own memory. A customer who had filed a complaint 2 years earlier and received a form email in response had kept the email in a folder. The way people keep things they are not sure they will need but cannot bring themselves to delete. What the investigators found when they went deeper was not one bad manager, though Blaine Cartwright was certainly that. What they found was a system. The loss prevention training materials described certain customer profiles in language that was, on paper, neutral, and in practice, a guide to racial targeting. Floor staff were evaluated on a metric that rewarded stops. There was no corresponding metric for stops that turned out to be unfounded. There was no tracking system for how often stops were made against customers from any particular group. There was no process that required anyone to look at the data and ask what it meant. There was, though, a paper trail. There is always a paper trail if someone is willing to pull it. Blaine was terminated within 10 days. The corporation released a second statement. It was longer. It contained a direct apology. It named him. It did not name the regional operations manager, who had submitted a letter of resignation the morning the commission's formal investigation notice was issued. Kyle resigned on his own. Delphine was offered a promotion 6 weeks after the story broke. She declined. She told the journalist who interviewed her that she had filed 2 internal complaints herself over the years, once about an incident she had witnessed, once about a comment a senior staff member had made in a meeting. Both had been dismissed without explanation. She had stopped filing after the second one because she had run out of faith in the process, and she had not known where else to go. "I just needed it to be real," she said. "I needed it to exist somewhere other than my own head." The commission's findings came 4 months later. 63 pages. They documented the 5 prior complaints, the training materials, the performance incentive structure, the 2 dismissed internal complaints Delphine had filed. They concluded that the corporation had engaged in a pattern of racial discrimination in its application of loss prevention practices, in violation of the Canadian Human Rights Act. The evidence was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was documented in video footage, internal records, complaint files, corporate communications, and a decade's worth of data that no one had been required to examine. The corporation entered a binding settlement, mandatory training across every management level, an independent external process for reviewing complaints, an annual requirement to publish disaggregated data on loss prevention stop, direct compensation to each complainant whose prior complaint had been improperly dismissed. There were 6 of them. None of them had a federal court credential. None of them had a title that a sergeant would recognize when he read it off a laminated card on a polished floor. All of them had done what Portia had done, stood their ground, stated the facts, filed through the proper channels, kept records, and had been returned silence, a form email, a phone call that never came, a closure report with no explanation and no follow-up and no acknowledgement that the complaint had mattered. One of them was a nursing student, 23 years old, who had been stopped 3 separate times at 2 different locations of the same chain over 18 months. She had kept records of each stop because her mother had told her, years ago, to always keep records. The investigator assigned to her second complaint was the same person who had cleared the first one. She had not known that. She had filed 3 complaints, waited through 3 silences, and eventually stopped filing, not because she believed what had happened to her was acceptable, but because she had used up every process available to her and had nothing left to try. Her name appeared in the commission's report as Complainant D. She was not quoted. She was 3 stops and a pattern in a table of data. Portia read all 63 pages on a Sunday morning. She read past the sections that concerned her own case. She read about Complainant D on page 41, and she sat with that for a long time without moving. She understood what the leather folio had and had not done. It had not made what happened to her on that floor more unjust than what had happened to the other 6. It had made what happened to her impossible to dismiss. The folio had slipped at the right angle on a polished floor, and Pallister had been close enough to read it when it opened. And Delphine had been standing at the right counter with her phone at the right angle. And all of those variables had aligned in a way that produced a 63-page report, and 6 settlements, and a binding consent agreement, and a change to how one corporation trains its managers. Remove the folio, remove the angle, remove Delphine, who held her phone steady for 44 seconds and then chose to post it. And what remained was a woman who paid for 3 books and walked toward the door and got stopped and filed a complaint and heard nothing. just like the 6 people before her. Portia continued her work. She returned to courtroom 4 on a Monday morning, put on her robes, and heard submissions in a matter involving statutory interpretation and administrative procedure. She gave every argument the careful weight it was owed. That was her job. She did not think of herself as a symbol. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had wanted to be a judge, and she was one. And she was going to keep being one, regardless of what a retail manager on King Street thought he saw when she walked toward the door in a gray sweater. What stayed with her, and she admitted this only to herself, late at night in chambers with the winter city visible through the window, was not Blaine's face in those 4 seconds. It was not the feel of the folio being handed back with both hands. It was the thought of the young woman who had kept records the way her mother had taught her to, and filed 3 complaints, and waited 3 times, and eventually stopped waiting. She had done everything right, everything that the system said to do. She had been precise and patient and documented, and the system had absorbed her and returned silence, because she was carrying nothing in her bag that made silence indefensible. Not a seal, not a crest, title on a laminated card. Just a true account that needed to reach someone with the standing to act on it. The Commission's report was adapted into a national human rights training module the following year, distributed to retailers and employers in every province. Facilitators used the King Street case in workshops because it illustrated something that was easy to miss and very hard to unlearn. That discrimination does not require a person to believe they are discriminating. That a system can produce unjust outcomes while every individual inside it believes they are following the rules. That the absence of a functioning complaint mechanism is itself a policy decision. That someone always pays for the silence, and it is never the person who signed the closure form. New management trainees would read through the case summary and look up from their materials at the facilitator standing at the front of the room. The facilitator would ask a single question. At what point in this situation did anyone stop and ask what they would do if they were wrong? The answer every time was the same. Not once. Not one moment. Not one person in that building on that afternoon had built in any space for the possibility that they were wrong, because the system they worked inside had never required them to. That was the thing worth examining. Not the one man who grabbed the bag. The whole architecture that had handed him the bag to grab and cleared every complaint and given him a commendation and never once asked what the pattern meant. If you have ever filed a complaint and received nothing back, not an acknowledgement, not an explanation, not even confirmation that someone had read what you wrote, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you filed it about and how long you waited. Because the report has 63 pages. But Complainant D is on page 41, and she deserves more than a row in a table. If this one stayed with you, hit the like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Velvet Honor if you want to be here for the next one. These stories are not hard to find. They are only hard to look at. We are going to keep looking.